Good afternoon. I'm Suzanne Borden, Moment Magazine's Moment Live producer. We are delighted to welcome you to this year's special literary event celebrating our Moment Magazine Karma Foundation Short Fiction Contest winners. And we thank you for joining us for our conversation, The Power of Memory in Jewish Fiction, with this year's contest judge, award-winning author Richard Zimler, and Moment's opinion and books editor Amy E. Schwartz. We first want to thank award-winning Broadway producer Sharon Karmazin, a member of Moment's advisory board and president of the Karma Foundation, which makes this contest possible. The Moment Magazine Karma Foundation Short Fiction Contest serves to jumpstart or further its winners' writing and publishing careers. We're pleased that over the years, many of our winners have gone on to publish short stories, anthologies, and novels, with their work appearing in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Tablet, Haaretz, Plowshares, and Tikkun, among many other publications. These writers have won prestigious fellowships and all kinds of awards. Sadly, we are now living in a time when many Jewish authors are finding it more difficult to get their Jewish stories published. So again, thank you, Sharon. We could not do this work without you, and today this contest is more important than ever. Moment has published a wonderful collection of some of these award-winning stories from over the years in the ebook Good Karma. You can access this book free of charge this week from the shop page on Moment's website by using the code KARMA, that's K-A-R-M-A. And we urge all writers out there to enter this year's 2025 short fiction contest. The deadline for submission is October 1st, and you can learn more about it from our website at momentmag.com. Before we begin today's conversation with Richard and Amy, we're excited to celebrate the winners of the 2024 Moment Magazine Karma Foundation Short Fiction Contest. Our first place winner is Alana Marcus from Washington, D.C. Our second place winner is Chava Chernobelsky from Jerusalem, Israel, and our third place winner is Basha Winograd from New York City. We also want to congratulate Marla Braverman and Nicole Hazan, who received honorable mentions for their stories. Last week, our three winners had the chance to sit down with Moment editor Sarah Brieger to talk about their stories and their writing process, as well as the Jewish writers that inspire them. Today, we'll share short excerpts from each conversation, and the full interviews will be posted shortly on Moment's website at momentmag.com. It is my pleasure to invite this year's contest judge, Richard Zimler, to introduce our writers. Richard?
Thank you very much. The Village on Targova by Basha Winograd is a well-crafted work that brings the reader back to Lodz during World War II. I greatly admired how the author created the atmosphere of a European city in which the wealthy enjoyed an opulent lifestyle that seems alternately grotesque and magical by today's standards. The main character hopes that his huge bank accounts and connections will enable him to avoid the fate of his fellow Jews. But maybe there are some things that his precious savings can't buy from even the most corrupt Nazis. Congratulations, Basha.
Hi, Basha. Thank you for being here today, and congratulations for being a winner in this year's contest.
Thank you so much.
Can you tell me a little bit about where the idea for your story came from?
Yes. This story started for me when I was a student at the National Film School of Poland in Łódź, and the school is housed in this beautiful villa. And there was some sort of general idea that the villa had once belonged to a rich industrialist. At the time when Łódź was a big industrial city, it was one of the biggest industrial cities in the world at the time. And but no one ever mentioned that he was a Jew, that Oscar Kahn was a Jew. And I don't think anyone even knew his name. And a few years after I finished that program, I just started to research it, and I thought it was interesting that he was Jewish. And I started to ask myself, well, what happened to him? Because, obviously the war was about to come. And it was really hard to get the information, but I was able, because I speak Polish, so I was able to do some research. And so I discovered some facts, but not all of them. So I had to kind of imagine a story for this man.
Are there any writers that you, either from the past or contemporary, who you drew inspiration from?
Oh yeah, I actually organized my books because all of these books are about Poles and Jews, mostly about Polish Jews. So the obvious, Bashevis Singer, I love Gary Steingart, Michael Chabon. The one that I want to talk about because I don't think she gets enough attention. People don't really know who she is Hava Rosenfeld, who was a Polish Jew, survived the Holocaust, moved to Canada, and wrote a bunch of stories, many stories. I don't know if, I mean, she's not very well known, but I only discovered her because Łódź, the city of Łódź, dedicated, I think it was the year 2024, they called it the Hava Rosenfeld year. And so I was like, oh, I've never heard of this writer. And I started to read her stories, and they're amazing. And they're kind of reminiscent of Bashevis Singer, that sort of tone. And she's a woman.
And do most of your stories have Jewish themes?
No, I write a lot of different things. I was raised Polish. I wasn't raised Jewish. I had some kind of vague idea that we were Jewish, but it wasn't like a part of my culture. It was just part of my history, but not really a part of my culture, I would say.
And when did it become more part of your identity?
Well, I think the literary world, that when I started to write about my family history, and I'm fascinated by Polish Jews, and it's almost like I have a friend who called me, she said, she's a Polish Jew, so it's like she's in a contradiction, right? So I was so that fascinates me, like what it means now to be a Polish Jew, especially since my family doesn't celebrate anything. So my work really deals with that. So, but when did it really start? Maybe like a decade ago, when I started to say like, okay, what should I write a book about? And my family story is really interesting. So I was like, well, let me do that. Let me write my family story.
Thank you so much. And congratulations again.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I'm so honored.
The Artist by Chava Chernobylsky is a mysterious story about a teacher who pays a down-and-out old friend to paint his new apartment. There's only one problem. Instead of simply doing what he's been asked, he creates a monumental artwork. This leaves his employer furious. And yet when visitors see his murals, they're moved to weeping. Why did these murals create such deep emotions in those who see them? The story left me trying to puzzle out what exactly he might have painted, and if it had anything to do with the crime against humanity that provoked the war in Gaza and the ongoing massacres of Palestinians. Congratulations, Chava.
Hi, Chava. First of all, congratulations for being a winner in our Moment Magazine Karma Foundation short fiction contest.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be chosen.
And also thank you for, staying up a little later because I know you're in Jerusalem. So your story was so different. And I'm curious if you could tell me a little bit about how you came up with the idea.
Yeah, so I think the seed of the story was just the idea of an artist making something that like other people get or they don't. I just thought that was an interesting idea. And then I think the rest of the story kind of like took shape around that, just regarding like the feelings of living here during the war and the different parts of society that are being stretched, and like the feeling of on the one hand, like really keeping going and moving forward, and on the other hand, like just like being ready to break down in a second, and how everyone kind of seems to be in that in-between space.
One thing that's interesting in the story, and I don't think it's a spoiler, but a lot of it centers around a piece of art, but you never actually describe the art, which I assume was intentional. In a way. In your head, do you know what you kind of are seeing it as?
No. To me, it was important that the art was like an engine for the rest of the story, and for like the relationships that are taking place around it, and that each person saw it as something different. And
you mentioned this briefly, but the story is not directly about October 7th, but it is about kind of the after effects and how it's affected, society in Israel. Has your writing changed post October 7th? And I'm curious what you think about kind of if there is this new genre of post October 7th writing that exists.
That's a really good question. I think that my writing became more honest.
Mhm.
Like, I think that before, I was probably not alone in feeling like, if you want, I'm not a published writer, but like if you want one day to be published, you have to be really careful about the things that you say and like what you're writing about. And there's a lot of rules. And I think after October 7th, I kind of felt like I'm going to write what I want to write about, and I'm not going to like think about what's publishable and what's not.
And then do you think there is this kind of post October 7th fiction that has emerged or is emerging now?
I think it's not possible for it not to be, because I think every single Jewish writer, whether they're identify as Zionist or as like not Zionist, their life has changed. Everything about the way that they look at the world has changed. So I think that is like the future of Jewish writing post October 7th.
And what advice would you give to writers who are perhaps starting out, or like you, perhaps this is not their main profession?
You never know until you try. Like, you just submit and get a writing group. Try and find people to read your writing. If all you do is write and sit in a drawer, no matter whether you like have an MFA or you have no training at all, if nobody ever sees what you wrote, it doesn't really exist.
Great. Thank you so much. And congratulations again.
Thank you so much.
What to Say by Ilana Marcus is a beautiful, moving, and insightful story about how we find the courage to pursue our goals despite the traumas and ongoing disappointments that our parents' failed marriages and the loss of their love create in us. The author uses clever dialogue and a highly compelling blend of empathy and wit to make us want to know more about her characters and what may happen next to them. I love the story. Congratulations, Ilana.
Hi, Ilana. It's good to see you. Congratulations for winning this year's contest.
Thank you so much. It's so exciting and a huge honor.
And actually, you are a second-time winner. I think it was 2 years ago you came in second place.
I came in third place.
Third place. Oh my gosh!
But I was very excited about that too. So.
So it's been exciting to see kind of your writing, like how your writing has progressed.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about how you came up with the idea for this piece?
Yeah. So the premise of this story about an affair followed by a death is actually something that happened on one side of my family years and years ago. And then the rest, which kind of like the emotional fallout and coping, is just kind of how I imagined the people close to that situation, what they might have been thinking about. All the characters are different, but it's kind of the original, like what might happen in that kind of situation.
Do many of your stories have Jewish themes?
Yeah, many of them do. I really like the idea of kind of setting stories in Jewish context, just because it doesn't have to necessarily be about a Jewish thing, but to have Jewish people or Jewish, milestones. I think it's a cool thing to bring to, the literary world. And not that I'm the only one doing it, lots of people do. But it's a little bit of a way that I can make a mark. And you like to write the stuff that you want to read. I love reading Jewish content too. So it's something that I found to be particularly rewarding.
Yeah. Are there any authors that you drew inspiration from when you were writing this piece?
So in the last couple years, I started reading a lot of Allegra Goodman, who judged, the competition that I placed in 2 years ago. I've been reading Elizabeth Strout. These are just two authors I hadn't come across until a couple of years ago. And I think both of their voices have, sort of shaped the way my writing has developed.
And writing fiction is not your full-time gig. I think you have a full-time job and then you do this on the side, right?
Yeah.
How do you balance those two things?
It's hard to stay consistent with the writing. When the rest of life gets busy, it's easy to kind of push it to the side. But it's something I always come back to. I have a bunch of writing friends now. I've kind of cultivated these friendships over the last, 5 or so years. It's made a huge difference just kind of having other people to, um, celebrate the good things, commiserate about the hard things, because it can be a solitary pursuit. But it makes a huge difference just having a writing community. So it's a big part of kind of what kind of brings me back to it when other things sort of pull me away for, too long periods of time.
And what are you working on now?
So I always have a lot of beginnings of pieces. This story that won, I think I started it like 3 years ago. And it just took a while to get it to where it, ended up. So I have other stories that are in various stages of development, I suppose. But lately I've been thinking about going back to some of the older ones that I thought were done, that I kind of like, with some retrospect, think maybe the story would be more interesting written from a different character's point of view, or maybe this ending didn't really make a ton of sense.
Great. Well, thank you again, and congratulations again.
Thank you so much.
Again, congratulations to Alana Marcus, Chava Chernobyski, Basha Winograd for winning the 2025 Moment Magazine Karma Foundation Short Fiction Contest. And thank you, Richard, for serving as this year's guest judge. Also, thank you to everyone who submitted their stories. And a reminder, this year's submission deadline is October 1st, so please start submitting your stories. You can go to our website at momentmag.com for more information. And now it is time for today's special conversation, The Power of Memory in Jewish Fiction. Please type your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to as many as possible at the end of the program. It is my pleasure to introduce today's guests. Richard Zimler has lived in Porto, Portugal since 1990 and has both Portuguese and American nationality. In 2017, Richard was awarded Porto's highest honor, the Medal of Honor, for his contributions to the culture of his adopted city and the entire country. He has published 13 novels and 7 children's books over the last 25 years. His novels have been translated into 23 languages and have appeared on bestseller lists in 12 different countries. 5 of Richard's novels explore the lives of different branches and generations of a Portuguese Jewish family. He refers to this group of fully independent works as his Sephardic cycle. Richard's most recent work, The Incandescent Threads, was named one of the best books of 2022 by the Sunday Times and Jewish Chronicle. It was also a finalist for one of the National Jewish Book Awards in the United States and a #1 bestseller in Portugal. Amy E. Schwartz is Moment Magazine's opinion and books editor, as well as editor of the magazine's popular Ask the Rabbi section. Before coming to Moment, Amy was a longtime editorial writer and op-ed columnist at the Washington Post, where she was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize in commentary. Amy is the editor of the book Can Robots Be Jewish? And Other Pressing Questions of Modern Life. Please welcome Richard Zimler and Amy E. Schwartz.
Hi, thank you very much. Thanks everyone for coming on, and thank you, Richard, especially for all the way from Portugal. And congratulations to the contest winners. And I was part of the previous round that read the stories that went to Richard, and it's really such a pleasure to see all these pieces of new Jewish fiction. So we're going to talk about the power of memory in Jewish fiction today. And this is kind of, when it comes to Jewish culture, this is kind of the topic that encompasses all other topics. So in your long career, Richard, all these novels, your 13 novels for adults and 7 for children, has been all about rediscovering and restoring lost Jewish memory and via fiction. And obviously it's met a need, a hunger, because from the beginning, it's been explosively popular. So when thinking about Jews and memory, I was thinking about the expression, the joke people sometimes say, "Oh, I've forgotten more than you'll ever know." So all this forgotten history, like, do Jews have more memory than other people, or have we just forgotten more?
I think both in a sense. I think as a persecuted people, a lot of our history has been excluded from the official histories of places like Poland and Portugal, where I live. So that, again, referring to Portugal, it was taboo to talk about Jewish culture, Jewish traditions, Jewish rituals in this country from 1536, when the Inquisition started, all the way up to the Democratic Revolution in 1975. So for 5 centuries, you couldn't talk about Jewish history. So, we get excluded quite frequently from official histories. And the second part of your question is, I think a great deal of Judaism, of our traditions, they're based on memory. And I always go back to Passover, which we've recently celebrated, because it's a very interesting blend of past and present, because Judaism does something extremely special that I'm not aware of in other religions, and maybe they exist, but I don't know of them. When we celebrate Passover, we are the slaves coming out of Egypt. The Lord took us out of Egypt and brought us to the promised land. And so history becomes the present time. We exist in an eternal present. And so it evokes empathy in each person participating in Passover or other celebrations. And I think that particular aspect of memory, of empathy, of putting ourselves in the place of Jewish slaves in Egypt 2,500 years ago, or Holocaust survivors, or survivors of pogroms in places like Portugal and Poland and Romania. I think we're trained as Jews to use our empathy and use our memory to become those people. And it's great training for a writer, of course, because we have to go into other people's lives and see the world from their point of view.
Well, that is an even better segue to my next question than I could have imagined, because I was going to ask you, like, writing historical novels makes you basically a time traveler.
Yes.
So, in the science fiction books, you can never jump to a time that you can't envision, right? You have to have a picture in your head. So you're jumping into, again, like forgotten things. I know you do years of research, but how do you know when you've arrived? Is there a feeling you get when you feel like you've got it right and it's a real memory?
That's a great question. For me, there's no one moment. I like to write The Last Kabbalist to Lisbon, which was my first novel, which takes place during a riot in Lisbon, a true event in which 2,000 forcibly converted Jews were murdered and burnt in the main square that's still at the heart of Lisbon. And no one knew about this event. It was completely taboo until my novel. And so I had to do a year of research. It was my first novel, so I didn't really know what I was doing. What kind of clothing did people wear? What foods did they eat? Were the houses, 1-story, 2-story, 3-story? Were the streets paved? I didn't know anything. And so you do this year of research, you accumulate a pile of notes, 2 feet high. And at some point, you just feel, you use your writer's empathy once again and your writer's imagination, and you feel, I'm there. I can start writing now. I can write the first word. And if there's other things I need to research, the layout of the streets back in Lisbon, then I'll go back to my books. But you feel like you can smell the olive oil and the yeast from the baking bread. You can see the cobblestone streets. You can see, unfortunately, people throwing waste out their window. You can hear the screams of people selling, tripe or sausages. And so when all your senses are engaged and you're there, that's when you can start writing. And if you're worried that you're making some mistakes, you go back to your notes and double check everything. But again, it's kind of like a magical process of how we feel at home, whether it's in Lodz in 1945 or in Jerusalem in the Middle Ages. It's magical.
It sounds magical. Are there places you've tried to jump to that you couldn't get there? Like projects
No, not yet, but it may happen. I remember Philip Roth, the great Jewish novelist, talking about when he was already quite old, saying, one day the magic leaves you. And I think all writers are scared about that time, like whether you're 85 or 90. I think what he meant was you no longer have the physical and spiritual strength to keep a huge parallel universe in your head. Because until a book is published, the universe is really only in my head. And it does require an enormous amount of spiritual, physical, mental strength. And I think there probably comes a point where you just don't have it anymore. And I think that's what he meant by magic. You just can't go back to Poland in 1945 anymore. It's gone. I hope that doesn't happen to me. We'll see.
I didn't mean to take you there. That's sort of dark. Sorry.
No problem. I mean, every novelist has limitations. I'll give you one limitation I have. We all have limitations. I always write in the first person. I can't write in the third person. It seems very distant from me. I don't have good control over it. I don't know how to shift from a description of a place or a time period and get into the head of my characters. So for me, writing in the first person solves all that problem, because for a year or 2 years, I'm Amy. It's not hard. I'm Amy, and I have my long hair cascading down my back, and I'm wearing a beautiful red blouse, and I'm you.
Right. But still a flatterer.
Yeah, you want your characters to be likable. It's at least the main character, maybe.
Right. That must be so natural to you, because I've read all of these different books, and it never occurred to me till now that was what they had in common, that you were always in the first person.
I haven't even tried to write in the third person since I was starting out and writing short stories like the Story Winners. And once again, congratulations to them. It was a thrill to read all their stories. Such great writing from every finalist. And the hardest part was just choosing 1, 2, and 3, because, it's so subjective. But I loved what one of the winners said, which was that she was trying to fit into the market and write books that would sell and be published. And of course, that's a temptation for all of us, especially now that publishing has become so commercial. But that after October 7th, unfortunately, she threw all that out the window, and she just wrote what she needed to write and wanted to write and felt passionate about, because that's what we need today to continue, having great literature. We need people who are passionate about what they're writing.
That actually also goes back to something I was reading around in some of your older reviews, and I saw that one of the when Last Kabbalist came out, it was described as by someone or other as the equivalent of Dan Brown infused with Elie Wiesel, and I thought, is that what you were going for?
No, sometimes you get in reviews all these strange comparisons that you don't really want. I mean, it's flattering if you're compared to a great author, but really that's not what, at least in my experience, any particular author is in search of. We don't want to be called the next Philip Roth or, the next Allegra Goodman. It's not in our mind, at least my mind. But, it's become a marketing tool. Agents will tell you, okay, describe your book in 2 sentences and use some comparisons. So you end up trying to say, well, it's like Stephen King meets Elie Wiesel, a tale of horror set during, the Warsaw Ghetto, and it's just horrible feeling that pressure. And of course,
this was very early in your career. You're no longer
right.
compared to anybody.
Thank goodness. Most reviewers are really try to get your book. I mean, in the sense of, they're willing to delve into the book and try to experience it and understand it. But every now and then you get someone who just doesn't grasp it, what you're trying to do. And that's another difficulty for young writers starting out. It was terribly difficult for me to get bad reviews. There was one in the San Francisco Chronicle, I remember, who, this was at the beginning of the kind of like the identity movement, and the author of the reviewer compared me unfavorably to Toni Morrison and Alice Walker because I wrote a book that had to do with slavery. And one of the voices is of a young African American slave woman. And basically, I think the reviewer was offended that a Jewish man, put himself in the body and in the mind of an African American slave woman. I didn't understand that at the time. But anyway, he compared me unfavorably to every great African American writer of the last 25 years. So I was so depressed. Oh, my goodness.
Well, let's okay. So let's go back to memory, which is a more of a, I mean, once you get talking about your bad reviews, it's
yeah, forget it. That's a dead end.
But one thing Jews don't have, or they have lots and lots of memories, is they don't really have a physical place to put it in a lot of cases, right? Because all this being kicked out of places, there's no built environment. There are no places you can point to, I mean, up to a point. So you have been involved in at least one very significant memorial building in Portugal on that square where that took place. I mean, can we regain memory by building memorials and museums? Is that?
Well, that's another excellent question. In the case of the memorial that's now in Lisbon, obviously I'm very proud of that because people at City Hall have told me without the last Kabbalist Lisbon, there would never have been a memorial to the 2,000 forcibly converted Jews who were murdered there and burnt. And people make pilgrimages there, which I think is really good. It's a way of honoring the people who gave up their lives for their traditions and their faith and their culture and who weren't remembered. They faced such an injustice because they had their voices stolen from them. And that's another thing historical novelists can do that I think is really important and is aligned to memory is we can speak for people who didn't have that chance. They died, and then their voices were carried away by the wind. And obviously, it would be best if they could speak for themselves, but they can't. A converted Jew who died in Lisbon in 1506, or a Jewish woman Taylor, who perished in the Łódź ghetto in 1943 and who never had a chance to tell her story. Well, what a blessing that we can do that, and we can go back and try and inhabit that person's life and bring those memories to Amy and me and everyone in 2025, and to have a place where people can go and have a pilgrimage and remember and honor. For me, the most important word is honor, the memory of those people and their lives, I do think is extremely important. Where I have a little trouble, and people may disagree with me here, is I've heard people going to Holocaust museums and coming out and saying, "Oh, now I get it. I feel like what it was like to be kept in a concentration camp." And my view is, no, you don't get it at all. You do not know what it was like to sleep in a barracks and have not enough food and get up and be frozen every day and try to survive and want to continue your life, and you can't. And you've seen your parents chosen for the ovens. Sorry, you don't understand. And I'm being a bit vehement about this, but I think at that point, the museum becomes like a fantasy of we can all understand what it was like to be in the Holocaust. And I don't really think we can, which is one reason I personally have stayed away from writing about the camps. I've written about the Warsaw Ghetto. I've written about the T4 program, which was the Nazi war on disabled people. But I leave the camps to Primo Levi and people who've been there. I don't know why, but I feel like it's untouchable terrain for someone like me. And other writers may feel differently, and that's fine. But for me, it's simply too difficult a subject, too sacred, too abominable for me to presume that I can understand it.
Well, it's interesting because, and then Levy himself had this paradox, which was if you were there and survived to tell the story, then you also don't know the story.
Right.
Because that wasn't the real story. The real story was the people who didn't make it. Like if you
Yeah.
survived, there was something unusual about your story. So, well, that actually
But
leads,
I think that was a lot of survivor's guilt, which is another
right.
aspect of the Holocaust. Those who survive always asking, why me?
Hmm.
Why did I make it when so many wonderful, good, beautiful, talented people didn't? And my interpretation of Primo Levi saying that is his guilt. But I could be wrong.
Well, I
Primo,
mean, he saw it anyway. If he didn't,
yeah,
if he didn't, if he wasn't one who died, then at least he
yeah.
was
He
close enough.
he knew. I
Yeah.
always recommend his books. They're unbelievably wonderful.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So that actually leads to another question. This comes up in a different way in the story, one of the prize stories that you talked about. This question of the silence at the center for the thing that can't be spoken about.
Right.
So you're a mystic, right? So that's a big deal. The can you talk about like what is the power of the thing that's not said or even that's not
Yeah. Well, that comes up in the story about the artwork that we really don't know what it is. And the power of that is that it forces us to think and reason and try to puzzle out, well, what would be a piece of artwork that would move me? Would it be about October 7th? Would it include both Jews and Palestinians? What would it be, a man weeping over a dead child? Would it be something grotesquely horrible? So the power of silence is really, it forces us back into ourself. It forces us back into our own most traumatic and wonderful experiences. It forces us to think, well, what does that silence mean? What is it evoking? And that's one of the keys to good writing, in my opinion.
Mm.
Sometimes when I give a writing workshop, and it's very hard to say what bad writing is and what good writing is, but I always use an example that bad writing is saying too much that's too obvious. Like I use the example, the phone rang and it was my mom, and she said that my father had had a heart attack and died. And I grew so sad and so depressed that I started crying. Well, that's bad writing because you don't need to say, I grew so sad and I grew depressed. It's enough that you burst into tears. The intelligent, sensitive reader will understand why you're crying because your father has died. And so that bad writing like that occurs 1,000 times over the course of the novel. And a wonderful thing occurs if you don't say too much, if you use the silence, if you use the ineffable, if you just don't speak about it, because then the reader fills it in.
Mhm.
And the reader is grateful to you. The reader says, oh, thank you, Richard Zimler, for not stating the obvious, for presuming that I'm an intelligent, sensitive person, because I get it. I understand why the character is laughing or crying or can't even continue speaking. And so it creates this wonderful bond between the author and the reader when you use silence, when you don't say too much.
Well, here's a question related to that, and this is more of a craft question.
Sure.
So when you write about a horror,
Yeah.
a forgotten horror, for instance, the massacre, this is like the question people sometimes ask novelists about sex scenes. Like, how much do you say? How close do you want to get?
Yeah, that's another great question. And when I was younger, for The Last Kabbalist, it was my first novel, I think I said too much. People will say it's the riot itself, the pogrom is like a Hieronymus Bosch painting, which is a wonderful compliment. And yet it's a very violent novel. And I think if I wrote it today, I would try to evoke the violence with less blood, with more psychological feelings. I'll give you an example from a famous film, from Psycho.
Mhm.
There's the shower scene, which is horrible and terrifying, but we never actually see the knife going into her flesh. These days you'd see her head cut off and, it would be horrible.
CGI would just, yeah.
It's all done through music and through quick camera angles. And I remember I'll tell you a story that at first seems like it has nothing to do with it. But back in the 1980s, AIDS hit San Francisco and Berkeley really hard where I was living. And I remember at a first AIDS conference, someone telling a story about an AIDS patient disfigured by the disease who came home and walked in the door, and his dog took one look at him and ran in the other direction. Now, that evokes more, I don't know what the word is, sadness, empathy, terror, an understanding of what this poor, AIDS patient was going through and the reaction to them, to the first AIDS patients. The dog couldn't even look at his best friend. And so I think of that example, and I use that actually in one of the books, that you can evoke deep, deep feelings in readers without blood and gore and, kidnapped kids and kidnapped women. And that's what I try to do now in my novels. I try to evoke psychological terror or deep feelings or move people without the graphic violence. And the same thing for sex scenes. I mean, when you write a sex scene, it's all about, in my opinion, what the bodily connections create in each person, the feelings, the desire, and it's not about which piece goes where, and when I see those scenes on TV or read them about which piece goes where, I'm just totally bored. I mean, because the interesting thing about sex is all in your head. So,
but it's interesting because to go back to the last Kabbalist, the massacre. I mean, in a certain sense, you evoke it more dramatically by not saying it, but on the other hand, you were punching through a wall of silence there.
Exactly.
So you can see why you might have needed to say more rather than less.
My decision to do that was based partially on my inexperience, but also, I mean, this has been taboo for 500 years, and these people were murdered and, taken out of their homes, and God knows how they were murdered, and then burnt in the main square. I owe it to them to tell the story, visually, very graphically, and so that we can hear their screams. We can there's a scene where I'm told, I don't know this, but the scent of burning human flesh is different. People who were near the crematoria, back in World War II will tell you that it doesn't smell like anything else. And so I used that in my novel because I wanted to evoke all our senses. And actually, we're talking about memory, and smell for any novelist is extremely important. The odors, the scents, the perfumes, because our sense of smell is keenly attached to our memory. I mean, if you think of your childhood and your mother baking bread, or, whatever it is, your dad cutting the lawn and the scent of the new grass, if someone evokes that in a novel and just mentions one scent, we're right back in our childhood. And so I use scents very often in my books to bring the reader there.
It's interesting. I wanted to ask you, since you mentioned the AIDS crisis, I wanted to ask you a question about that. I mean, I know part of your backstory, how you moved to Portugal, and
sure,
is had to do with trying to put some distance between you and the ravages of AIDS. But one thing that struck me about that was when you take on all these forgotten and lost, horrors of Jewish history, your formative horror, so to speak, one of the horror that you yourself are coming from is not really a Jewish story. So I'm just curious. I mean, I know you've talked a lot about how the AIDS crisis shaped you personally, but how did it shape your work?
Well, I sometimes say there's a before time and an after time in my life, and what makes the fulcrum in between them is my brother's death. My brother died when he was only 35, suffering from AIDS. I helped take care of him and fought to save his life and failed. And like all of us back then in 1980s. And so it changed me completely, one of your authors, one of the winners, said it made her more honest. Well, it made me completely honest. I understood now that life isn't fair, and you're often disappointed, and you often suffer traumas. And, I talk about we're all survivors. All of us have gone through traumas. So when we see a person on the street or in a theater and they look happy and they look content, well, yeah, they may be, but they've had to survive the death of a parent, grandparent, maybe the illness of a child. They've been in the hospital. So we're all survivors. And I use that because I'll give you an example. The worst day of my life for many years was my brother's funeral. I didn't want to be there. I hated every moment of it. I was just in a cloud of despair and guilt and nightmarish horror. And there's a scene in one of my novels, The Warsaw Anagrams, which takes place in the Warsaw Ghetto. And the main character, who's a Jewish psychoanalyst, who's in his 70s, and it's the worst day of his life. I don't want to give a spoiler, but his great grandnephew has died, his beloved grandnephew, and he has to go to the funeral, and he can't bear it. And to write that scene, his name is Eric, and to be true to Eric and his feelings, I just went back to my brother's funeral. I was there. And so I transposed my feelings and I put them in Eric, and I'm really proud of that scene. For me, it works really well. And that's all based on my memory, my personal memories. And we do that constantly in our novels. We take our best memories, our worst memories, and we put them in other people and in other situations. And that's how they become so moving to other people, hopefully.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. I'm starting to see, maybe I was missing something, but it feels like around now we're starting to see a lot of fiction that talks about the AIDS crisis, or the period when that was sort of the biggest thing going on. And that's a couple of decades ago now, more than a couple. So one thing we were talking about, and it came up with the one of the award-winning stories, is about October 7th fiction.
Yeah.
And how people are starting to write October 7th fiction. What's your sense of, I mean, it's happened with Holocaust fiction too. There was a pause.
Yeah.
Then there was a burst. Is there kind of it's a dumb word, but kind of a periodicity to this? I mean, will October 7th fiction start right away, or will it change?
It's hard to predict because a lot depends on the publishing market, as one of your winning authors said. A lot of Holocaust fiction or nonfiction wasn't published because publishers simply refused to put them into print. I mean, Anne Frank's diary was refused, you can correct me if I'm wrong, by 10 American publishers. They didn't think it would sell, as if the most important thing about Anne Frank's diary was being a bestseller. I mean, it's crazy. And the same thing happened with AIDS. No one wanted to publish the books. I wrote a book that has something to do with my brother and that crisis, and no one would touch it. And so that was a big problem back then. Will it be a problem for October 7? I don't know. The need I suspect in Israel, the need is so great to talk about that, talk about the hostages, talk about how an Israeli friend once told me this was their 9/11. Mm-hmm. So maybe a lot of wonderful fiction will come out of that and be published in Hebrew. Mm. Will the same books come out in English, French, Polish, German, Japanese? I have my doubts. Because each country has its history, each country has its needs, each country has its stories that it absolutely has to evoke. And I really don't know what's going to happen with the October 7th. One danger I noticed in some of the stories, and again, this is very subjective, so take whatever I say with a huge grain of salt. I think we need time sometimes for lack of a better expression, to digest what's happened, to experience those feelings, and to put them on paper without, once again, excuse me for belaboring this point, but without saying too much. Mm-hmm. And some of the stories I read about October 7th, it was almost like they were written with their fists, and And you can't do that. You can write angry, but it has to be a small burn, a small little flame inside your heart. Because if you're too angry, you're too upset, then that comes through on the paper, and you tend to overwrite, to say too much, to express too much emotion that the reader will understand himself or herself. And so I think maybe for some writers, it'll take another year, 2 years, 5 years to write the beautiful, beautiful, beautiful novel that they have in their heart.
Mm-hmm. So we're in Israel, so let me take a leap way back, and I want to ask you about the Lazarus book a little bit.
Yeah.
You wrote a book called the Lost Testament of Lazarus. I forget if I got the title
The
exactly
Lost
right.
Gospel of Lazarus.
Lost Gospel of Lazarus, about the man who comes back to life.
Yeah.
And in the New Testament. And one of the things that made me think of, I mean, we're talking about sort of the unspoken and, you know, the thing that nobody knows. And I mean, how much of this quest for memory is really about the fear of death?
Well, that's a fabulous question. Gosh, well, it's probably a lot. I think more than death, it's the fear of disappearing and never having left anything behind. I mean, that's what I think of when I recall the 6 million Jews who perished in the Holocaust. I don't know, it's hard to put myself in their place, but not just dying, but leaving nothing behind. No one will remember you. No one will go to your graveside. No one will weep over you. No one will understand your sense of humor and that you played the violin and that you were, and that to me is heartbreaking. And I think many writers want to leave something behind. I have my books, and my books have their own lives and their own journeys to take. And, maybe I didn't accomplish anything spectacular in my life, but I wrote, all these novels, and someone will read them 20 years from now, hopefully. And that was me. And I sometimes think if anyone ever wants to know what I was like, what was best about me, what was most moving and wonderful and difficult, read the books, because everything that's best and worst in me is in the novels. And I wonder if other novelists feel that, but I bet they do.
Well, the writer cheats death, right? That's the great.
Yeah, not really.
It's the great hack,
Yeah, it's a good try.
Right.
I wonder if actors feel the same way. I watch these old black and white movies. I watched Dial for Murder with Ray Milland. Did he feel like he would have eternal life because there he is on the screen? I wonder.
Right, at his most beautiful or whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. So, I mean, but you've written a lot of ghost stories or ghost-ish stories. I know last time we spoke some years ago, we were talking about Jewish and mystical views of the afterlife, and you mentioned this concept of the ibur, the ghost who comes back because he still has something to accomplish.
Exactly. You have a great memory.
Well, I mean, I did go back and look, but also but I noticed there are a lot of ghosts in your novels, in different novels.
I think that the specific Ibor concept comes out of my readings of Kabbalah, of Gershom Shalom, and I've been reading Kabbalah for 30 years. But it also comes out of, I think, I'm not sure, I believe in a personal God, but I believe there's more to this reality than what's obvious. Mm-hmm. And part of that is that we live in a world, and it's irrational, but we live in a world of memories, of spirits, of the past, of our grandparents and great-grandparents, and Poland for me, because all my grandparents came from there. And it's not scientific, but the human mind isn't always scientific. And we live in that world. We live in an irrational world, a world of anxieties and difficulties. And so for me, writing about spirits or iburs is realistic. It's not realistic from the scientific point of view, but it's realistic from the point of view of the human mind and the human heart. because who hasn't felt at a particular moment in their life, I can feel my mom. Like if I close my eyes, I can still feel my mother's hands.
Mhm.
Absolutely. And so that's part of what makes us human. And so to leave that out of our novels would leave out a very important part of what makes us, who we are, I think.
Right. And the Ybor in the Warsaw Ghetto novel was interesting because he didn't know why he had come back, right?
No.
What were you doing with that?
Well, that came out of the first page of the book, because the original idea for the novel, this is how things change. The original idea for the book was to be about an elderly Jewish man who leaves a labor camp or a concentration camp. He survives and he walks back to Warsaw, where he's from. And he's talking in the first person again on the first page of the book, and he says, my wife is gone. No one in Warsaw needs a psychiatrist right now. They need food and water, and he said, I'm a dead man. I might as well be dead. And I got chills because I thought, he is dead. He's an Ybor walking back to Warsaw because he doesn't know where else to go. And I had read previously in my books of Gershom Scholem in Kabbalah that Ybors, or Dybbuk is a more modern word, or spirits, they remain in our dimension because they still have a mitzvah to fulfill. And that idea struck me as incredibly important. And so Eric, my narrator of the book, who's an Ybor, a Dybbuk, a spirit, he realizes that he has a mitzvah to fulfill. But I thought, what a great plot that he doesn't know what it is. And so there's only one very visionary man in Warsaw who can see and hear him. So Eric tells the story of his last year in the ghetto, this wonderful, tragic, horrible, beautiful year, in order to try to find out why he's there. What's this amazing mitzvah that he's still got to fulfill? And I don't want to give a spoiler, but at the end of the book, he gives his interpretation of why he remained in our dimension.
Right. And of course, you could even take the Dybbuk out of it and people might still be wondering what they're doing here on Earth. What's the one thing?
Absolutely. I mean, we all at some point feel, especially as we get older, what was the point of this? I think parents have it easier because you have the kids and you think, well, I have my daughter, I have my son, I have the grandkids. Those of us like me who haven't had kids, I may be wrong, but we go through a period where we think, well, what was it all about? What was my purpose here? What will I leave behind?
But you've got all these books.
And I got all these books. So that's my answer. And someone else will have created, wonderful paintings or built beautiful furniture or fought to keep our democracy in America. And that's enough. That's wonderful.
Right. Right. So it sounds like do you still, when you sit down to write a new book, do you not know exactly where it's going or like what it's about? Does it still surprise you?
Yeah. I usually know the first chapter, and if I've done my research, the characters have come out of the research. I know what's going to happen in the first chapter. Like Eric's going to come back to Warsaw. He's going to slowly start to figure out he's an Ybor, a spirit. No one can see him except this one visionary man. And then I didn't know what the rest of the book was about. I knew he was sort of going to tell the story of his life in the ghetto, but what happened to them there, I had no idea. And that makes it more exciting for me because I'm discovering what the book wants to be. Mm-hmm. Because all books, you can have a great idea for a novel, and then as you write it, the book changes your idea, and you go, no, the book's not going to be about the divorce and how horrible it was and how the main character remade her life. No, the book is about something else. And it's only while we're writing the narrative that the book tells us that. And you got to listen. You can tell when the writing's going wrong. It's not working. The characters seem artificial. The plot seems contrived. You need to listen to the characters and pay attention to what they want to do and say. And if you do that, you'll probably come up with a really good novel.
So are there, I'm going to wrap up soon, and there are a couple of questions.
Okay.
Not too many because you've been absolutely definitive.
Okay.
But so are there more figures you're still thinking that you want to bring back to life that you haven't? Or I mean, would that be telling? Are you working on?
Well, I'm not finished entirely with the Zarco family, which is my Portuguese Jewish
Right.
family. I don't know when and where they'll crop up, but I do know that I want to write about them again because I still feel very passionately about Portuguese Jewish history. I didn't know anything about Sephardic history when I started out, and I discovered it was tragic and dramatic and moving and wonderful. I'll tell you one quick story about why I write about Jews from Portugal and Spain. I remember reading an article in a magazine and about Jews who'd left 4 centuries ago to go to Turkey, which was one of the places that received the Portuguese and Spanish Jews who were kicked out and converted. There was a man who had his house key from a small city in Portugal called Beja, and the family members had passed it down for 5 centuries. Now, what does keeping your house key tell you if you're a novelist or a psychiatrist or just a intuitive person? They want to go home. They want to go back to Portugal. And I thought this is so moving. These people who've kept up their traditions, their language, their food for 5 centuries, who have their house keys and who still think of Portugal and Spain as the promised land. I have to write something about these incredible people. And so for me, part of the excitement about writing my historical novels is just recapturing a part of Jewish history that was neglected and people who were persecuted and whose stories were taboo in both Spain and Portugal for centuries.
Yeah, wow. So, so actually, one of the questions speaks to that a little bit. Of one of the viewers writes in, at different times, Jewish children have had to hide their identity to survive. What has happened? What happens to their memories in those circumstances? I think one of our prize winners alluded to that.
Yeah, that's another great question. The Jews who were converted in Portugal, they had to live with a mask. Outside the home, they were good Catholics. They went to mass and they prayed the correct way. And inside their homes, with the curtains closed and the doors locked, they could practice the Sabbath ceremony or whatever rituals they wanted to practice. And so they had double lives, and they lived
Great risk, right?
a huge risk because if they were denounced and caught, they would be arrested and tortured and kept in an inquisitional prison starting in 1536 in Portugal and earlier in Spain. And the worst part of it is, well, it's hard to say what the worst part is, but the church wanted them to name names. So they would say, Richard, you were practicing the Sabbath, and finally you admit it after torture. And they would say, well, who else? And then I would say, well, my good friend Amy was there, and my cousin Susan was there. And then they'd arrest you, and they'd arrest Suzanne, and the whole process would continue. So it was an absolute machinery of death that the Catholic Church instituted in Portugal and Spain. And so what I discovered is that living beneath the mask creates an inner conflict because you want to lead an authentic life, but you can't. So it's not just a conflict of Jews with the church or with church authorities. It's an inner conflict. You can't be yourself. And so the first thing that happened when people escaped and moved to Italy or the Ottoman Empire or North Africa or later in Amsterdam, New York, Brazil, is they could declare their faith openly and live as themselves. And the huge relief they experienced and joy they experienced as finally not having to lock the doors and close the curtains to simply say a Hebrew prayer. And so that's what struck me the most is this inner conflict of my characters.
So when their memories it's a burden, it's not, make use of it.
I would suspect that once they got to a place where they could practice their faith openly, their memories were mixed. they had this huge longing to be back in Portugal or Spain, and yet at the same time, this absolute despair over having to live 30, 40, 50 years of their life inauthentically with a mask on and pretend to be something they weren't. So I suspect, and in my characters, their memories are very mixed. The most wonderful memories mixed with the most awful sacrifices.
Mm-hmm. And that's reality, right?
That's reality.
So I'm going to give you a wrap-up question. One of the viewers says, "Who painted that fabulous canvas behind you?" In the
Behind me. Well, that's another good question. My friend Timothy Hyman. Unfortunately, Tim died about a year ago. Wonderful English Jewish painter. Look us work up Timothy Hyman, and he has very strange figurative expressionist works. And he asked me to write the introduction to one of his catalogs. And for me, I'm going to use a word that maybe not many people know. He has picaresque paintings. Picaresque was a school of particularly Spanish Jewish writing. Picaresque was like the trickster. Their heroes turned the world upside down. Created problems for everybody else. And in Tim's painting, you can't really see, it's too far away. He always has himself looking on at a strange angle. So he's the trickster. He's the Loki, the Norse mythology. He's the guy who turns everything upside down. And I love that about Tim's work. And so Hyman, Hyman, he still has his website, I think. And Tim was a lovely, wonderful, beautiful friend. And one of the hardest things about growing old is losing all these beautiful people who helped you in your life.
So one of the viewers has helpfully put his website up in the chat.
Oh, thank you.
So I love, we have the best audiences.
Yeah.
And I think on that note, I'm going to hand it back to Suzanne. But Richard, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. Thanks for judging our contest. Thanks for everything. Thanks for the stuff you've done for Moment. And this has just been such a pleasure. And
I love being on with you. Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, everyone at Moment. It was such a thrill and an honor to judge your contest. And one last comment. When I read the writings of younger Jewish writers or younger writers in general, and I feel like I'm participating in the continuum of literature. Like literature started, 3,000, 4,000 years ago, and it's continuing. So it's a joy for me to read wonderfully talented young writers.
Great. Well, again, I also echo my thanks to both of you. It was a fabulous conversation. I do want to point out, though, it so happened that this year's winners were all younger, but that should not stop anybody. We have we have had winners in previous years of all ages. And so at any age, even if you've never submitted anything before, we encourage you to do that again. Remember, the deadline is October 1st. I wanted to let everybody know that I also put a link to Richard's website in the chat so you all can see all the books that he has written, and I will include that in the follow-up email. Once again, thank you and congratulations to our Moment Magazine Karma Foundation Short Fiction Contest winners, Alana Marcus, Chava Chernobylsky, and Basha Winograd. Again, check out their stories. They'll be coming to Moment's website in the coming months. One more time, special thank you to Sharon Karmazin and the Karma Foundation for their support. And don't forget to go to Moment's shop page where you can this week download Good Karma for free. It's with the code KARMA, KARMA. Again, I will include all of this in a link, these links to you in a follow-up email. Again, thank you to our winners. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Amy. And we will see everybody next time.